The first moment that I tried to pull away from him, he just grabbed me by my throat and squeezed so hard. And I was terrified. I knew that there was only one way for it to end. And I wasn't willing to let it end with me dead. I just knew like I had to fight back. I always saw my parents being very loving. I can remember, my dad kissing my mom good morning in the kitchen, and I always wanted that. My name is Gemma Donahue. I was sentenced to 10 years in the Department of Corrections. I was born in Berlin, Germany. My father was in the military. I was the baby of the family. Everybody says the baby is spoiled, but that wasn't the case in my household. I didn't get away with anything. Like, I was almost punished before it ever even happened. We didn't really have friends because we moved every 5 years. So we just really loved and embraced each other as a family. I was homeschooled from 2nd grade until 6th grade. And then my mother decided to enroll my brother and I in public school. The children were a lot more advanced than I was. They just knew more about the world around them. Whereas I feel that we were kind of kept in a bubble. My last year in middle school was really hard. After the assault, I had begged my mom not to call the police because I just wanted to act like nothing had ever happened. And she promised me that she wouldn't, and then she did. I do remember law enforcement was trying to deter my mom as far as pressing charges, which, of course, my mother, she's a mama bear, so she was like, no, she's gonna continue this. I experienced a lot of bullying. I had to leave the school district. I blame my mother for a lot that happened when I was a teenager. She became so protective. I really wasn't allowed to have friends. My mom would do background checks on everybody. So I stayed at home a lot. Everybody around me was telling me that, that I ruined my life. And the day that I gave birth to my son and looked in his eyes, I knew there was nothing I wouldn't do for my children. There's nothing in the world like coming home from a hard day's work and walking through that door and your children just running up to you and wrapping their arms around you. That moment. We were introduced from a mutual friend. Javon had went to prison, so he was being released from prison, and the same mutual friend had asked me if I would let him use my address as a home plan. And I said yes. I remember just being so curious about his childhood because it was so different from mine. He bounced around a lot, and that was new to me, and it was almost tragic. He was previously incarcerated for manufacturing and distribution of drugs, but I believe that he had been rehabilitated and changed his life around. So from the very beginning, I just had this longing, like I needed to protect him. We never really established that we were going to be together. It just kind of sort of happened. I was going to University of Central Missouri, and he would stay at home with the kids. And that spoke volumes to me that he could be trusted with my children. The officer at the time said to me, Javon was a well-known crack cocaine dealer in that county. And I was just floored because I had never heard or seen anything like that. And that was like the first instance I ever realized that maybe there were things going on behind my back that I wasn't exactly aware of. I was angry with Javon. And I was like, you just need to go, leave us alone. And he just grabbed me by my throat and squeezed so hard and was like choking me. I remember to the point that I couldn't breathe and I was terrified. And he was telling me, like, you're never gonna leave me. The only way that you'll ever leave me is if I kill you, bitch. I remember saying to him, like, I love you. Why are you doing this to me? And he would tell me, fear lasts longer than love. Like, he never wanted to hear that I loved him. I would tell myself that if I could just help him or get him away from the drug scene, that our marriage would be better. But the abuse with Javon continued throughout our marriage. I learned really early on that the less that I struggled during a strangulation, the quicker I would pass out, and that made things easier. I do believe that Javon loved me, but the only way he knew how to show me was through violence. It was just a nightmare. But I think that also is what made the good times so good, because they were so far and few in between, and we cherished them. Which brought us to Good Friday, which would have been April 14th of 2017. I just remember being really anxious because it was going to be the first time since obtaining the order of protection that I was going to be alone in the house. I went downstairs, and when I opened up the family room door, Javon was standing there. He flew forward at me, grabbed me by my throat. He started dragging me up the stairs by my neck. The scariest thing in the world is to know that somebody else is holding your life in their hands. He started checking the windows and the doors, making sure they were all locked. He went back downstairs, and then I heard him call my name, and I went downstairs. And when I stepped into the bedroom, he was holding a gun. And he pulled the trigger, and the gun jammed. It didn't go off. So he became angry that the gun was like not working, and he hit me over the head with it. And whenever he did, it fell to the ground. So I picked it up, and I just remember like aiming it at him. And I told him, I won't, just leave, just get out. And he didn't want to, so he stepped forward. And whenever he made that forward motion, I just pulled the trigger. I hit him about right here in his left shoulder. And he screamed, like, you hit me. And then lunged forward at me again, grabbed me by my wrists. So my hands were kind of up like this, and he had both my wrists, and I pulled the trigger again, and he was flinging me around and slamming me to the ground, and in that motion I pulled the trigger again. When he landed on top of me, like as we were coming down on the ground, he said, "Fuck it, we're gonna die together, bitch." And he laid his head right next to my head, and he grabbed the back handle, like the butt of the gun, and aimed it towards his left ear. And I just wrapped my finger around to grab control of the handle and pulled the trigger. And I just remember that last final shot, just feeling the weight of him on top of me. Everything was black. I never realized my eyes were closed. Like, I thought it was black because I was like dead. I thought it was. And then I just kind of crawled out from under him when I realized, like, okay, it's over. I'm not dead. My mom pulled up from work and the phone was ringing. And it's saying like Johnson County on the caller ID. I have no recollection of calling 911, but I remember that I did call 911. And I handed her the phone. And I was like shaking my head no. I was like, please. I just felt like in that moment, my best decision of protecting my family and my children was to not let anybody know. My mom answered the phone. And she said it was a mistake. We didn't mean to call. The dispatch then said to her, we're gonna send somebody out there anyways. So I went and sat outside and waited for the police. I remember my mom coming out to the front step and kind of tapped me on my shoulder and rubbed me and said, come inside, Jem. No one's coming.
My name is Margaret Heffernan, and I'm the mother of Gemma Donahue. Gemma is the youngest of 3 of my children. I can remember her as an infant sitting on my lap, and I said, you'll never be too old. She excelled in school. Things were going in the right direction until she was sexually assaulted at the age of 13 by a 21-year-old man. At me, it's like a switch went off on me, and I drove straight for him. I was going to hit him. And the individual jumped over hedges. I lost common sense, I guess you could say. I had the sheriff's department come out to my house. Oh, they said, well, possibly if I don't press charges against him, they won't press charges against me. And I said I would not drop the charges. Gemma was very angry with me for contacting the police. She felt that I betrayed her. And our relationship, I would say, was damaged through her teenage years because of that. You want to protect your child. And you want to be able to handle a situation. And it was out of my hands. I questioned him. And I says, did you put your hands on my daughter? And he didn't answer me. And I told him, you just answered me by saying nothing. I says, promise me you will never lay your hands on her again. And he wouldn't say the words. I'm angry that he hurt my daughter repeatedly. Especially, when I would ask him, please don't. She's a survivor of domestic violence. It was self-defense. Nobody knows what they're going to do until they're in the situation. And it's done.
My name's Aaron Brown, and I'm a major here with the Johnson County, Missouri Sheriff's Office. I got a call from a source. They advised that Javon Donahue was, in fact, shot and killed by his wife, Gemma. And during the process of that, the body was taken to the farm and buried on the farm. We went out to the residence, the farm. But Johnson County is a rural county. It's a cattle grazing farms area. So just merely driving down a road, you're not able to see terribly much, just the house. We needed a helicopter or a plane to go overhead to look at this property. At this point, it is a crime scene. So we tape it off. We begin coordinated interviews with everybody that was on the property or in the house. Now, during the conversation with one of the individuals at the farm, they had advised that they knew where Javon was buried at on the property, and they led us to Javon. We dug up the body, wrapped in a white tarp with rope around the tarp. We needed to locate those individuals and conduct interviews with them immediately. And one of those happened to be Gemma's mom.
I told him. I saw Gemma standing outside, dazed. She said, Javon is in the house. I says, we need to call the police. No, he's dead. I said, are you sure he's dead? And she says, he's dead. She had dialed 911 and hung up. 911 called back. She's throwing the phone at me. She's shaking her head no, back and forth, but no words. And I told him, I'm sorry to bother you, that I made a mistake. And he said, unfortunately, we still have to send somebody out. And I said, I understand. I remember saying to her, when the cops come, Gemma, please let me tell them I did this. I lived my life. You have children to raise. She said, no, Mom, I will not. But it's what I wanted to do. I let Gemma down when she was 13, and I felt I can't do that again to her. I remember our relationship just being undone overnight. I didn't want to go through that again. We were probably out there a good 45 minutes and they never came. And I told myself, maybe this is the way it's supposed to be. When the police didn't show up at the house was the turning point that will take matters into our own hands. I thought, okay, we can do this. We can get away with this. We placed Javon's body in an area that he dug, and he says, I don't want you to know where I'm going to bury him. I have 2 other holes dug. And I thought, well, that's good that I won't know. I prayed that Gemma was going to be strong enough to keep her mouth shut and not share this with anybody, that we would have to go to our grave knowing what we did.
My name is Dr. Lisa Witcher, and I was a state-appointed forensic examiner for Gemma's case. When we're looking at battered spouse syndrome, we're looking for the cycle of violence. Part 1 is this tension building phase. So where you start seeing the perpetrator of the abuse becoming triggered by either you or the environment around them. The second phase is the acute or crisis phase. That is when violence occurs. After that, the honeymoon phase, when the batterer promises to never let that happen again. And then the cycle starts over again.
There was an incident. We were in a motel room, and Javon raped me, sodomized me, and afterwards he called his friend and was kind of laughing and making jokes, saying, how long is it going to take her to stop, like, bleeding, like, from my rectum, and just anything to humiliate me or degrade me.
You know, calling and bragging about beating a woman, it's either a twisted call or somebody come intervene, or it's truly despicable. It's truly someone who believes that they have done what's right and taken what's theirs. I am surprised that Gemma made it as long as she did, and that she is alive at the end of this story. Had he not come to the house that day, I don't think he would have stopped pursuing her. She meets all of the factors that we look for, and that research has shown is tied to women who become battered spouses.
To my knowledge, battered spouse as a self-defense has not been successful yet in Missouri. It's been here a while, but it has not really ever been a successful defense. Okay, come on. But the question wasn't whether or not she suffered from battered spouse syndrome, it was whether or not she used deadly force justifiably under the circumstances. A slap to the face doesn't justify someone shooting someone. My name is Rob Russell, and I was the attorney who prosecuted Ms. Gemma Donahue for the homicide of Javon Donahue.
As we were coming down on the ground, he said, "Fuck it, we're gonna die together, bitch." And he laid his head right next to my head, and he grabbed the butt of the gun and aimed it towards his left ear, and I just wrapped my finger around and pulled the trigger. And I just remember that last final shot, just feeling the weight of him on top of me.
Well, her story doesn't match up with the injuries suffered by Mr. Donahue. There are 4 bullets in his body. One is in the shoulder, one is through his jaw, one is in the back of his head, and one is underneath his chin, straight up. The shot to the back of the head would have been a fatal shot. The shot underneath his chin was a fatal shot. His jaw would have been broken in such a way that he would not have been able to talk to her and tell her that he loved her, and in this Romeo and Juliet moment they were both going to die together. That didn't happen because he couldn't talk. So I don't think the jury really bought into that she was acting in self-defense. Certainly when people try to hide evidence of a homicide, and certainly hiding the body tends to give you the impression that the person who's doing that has a guilty conscience. If they had accepted the self-defense argument from Ms. Donahue, she would have been found completely not guilty. But instead, they found her guilty of manslaughter.
I think that the decisions that were made after Javon was killed did put her in prison. The dedication to burying the body really stuck in the craw of a lot of the jury members. Her mom certainly could have acted differently. I don't know if in her mother's mind that was really a choice. But the concealment of Javon's body made things a lot worse for Gemma.
I blame my mother for a lot that happened when I was a teenager. I really wasn't allowed to have friends. My mom would do background checks on everybody. So I stayed at home a lot.
You know, becoming a social pariah at a very young age for sexual assault, she could not help. Then the withholding of any type of social relationship. Essentially, what her mom was doing was holding her hostage, holding her in such a safe place that it went overboard. It went overboard into, quite honestly, emotional abuse. Not letting your child out of the house ever, not letting her socialize in any normal type of way, certainly sets up a sense of learned helplessness. I don't think there's anything malicious about it. I just do not believe their relationship has ever been healthy. Gemma describes her mother as an evil, wicked woman who is controlling and vengeful. If she has the chance, she will kill me, I'm sure of it. She will bury me like she did my husband. It's very possible that the line, she will bury me like she buried my husband, was Gemma's acknowledgement of, I'm into this even further now because of her involvement.
During my trial, I had a strained relationship with my parents. I was drinking. I was abusing drugs. Do I think today that my mother would kill me or bury me in a field? No. We've come so far. It's not even the same relationship. Like, we're not even the same people. I've made great strides, and she's made great strides.
I've changed as a parent, realizing that my ways of being a helicopter mom over an adult was wrong. It's their life, their choice, their decisions, and their consequences. This part of me that always had to be in control and fix problems. Why give myself more problems than I already have? You know, it's just, It's not my problem. I don't need to fix it. Of course, I would do things differently if I blamed the police not showing up. But ultimately, I told them, like, you don't have to come. It was a mistake. So I started that. I started that with a lie. And the day had to come where I had to acknowledge it. I have learned a lot, about accountability and the importance of it in order for a person to learn by their mistakes. I have seen such improvement in Gemma since she's been incarcerated. She lights up when I see her, when I visit her. And always a big hug, a kiss on the cheek. That's my daughter. That's the baby that I had.
When I first came to prison, life was in an uproar. But once I started to take advantage of the different programs I enrolled in, like women's empowerment, I was able to kind of see my prison life in a different light. It wasn't so much condemnation as much as rehabilitation. Also, in here, I've learned accountability, because the fact is I still made the choices that I made.
The shot to the back of the head would have been a fatal shot. The shot underneath his chin was a fatal shot. He would not have been able to talk to her and tell her that he loved her, and in this Romeo and Juliet moment, they were both going to die together. That didn't happen.
There was no Romeo and Juliet moment where Javon said, "Do you love me?" He said, "We're gonna die together, bitch, till death do us part." Those were his words as he was slinging me around and slamming me to the ground. It's a really hard situation to decide whose life is more important, or do you take the chance of fighting for your life? I hate the fact that I have to wake up every day and know that I took somebody's life. And on top of that, it was someone's life whom I loved.
I never say it to her. When the cops come, Gemma, please let me tell them I did this. She said, "No, Mom, I will not."
I admire what my mother risked in helping me and trying to save me. She threw everything away. And honestly, I probably would do it for my children as well. I mean, not go about it like that, but we do what we need to protect and save our babies. This time in our life is almost over, and I see all good days ahead for us.
It was supposed to be the last carefree night before Christmas. A football game, bright stadium lights, teenagers laughing beneath the cold December sky. The kind of evening that disappears into memory without anyone realizing it is about to become history. But on the night of December 17th, still 1974, in Fort Worth, Texas, one young couple walked away from a crowded parking lot and unknowingly stepped into one of America's most haunting cold cases. Within hours, an 18-year-old girl named Carla Jan Walker had vanished. 2 days later, her body would be found abandoned in a remote culvert. The brutality of the crime would stun investigators. The absence of answers would torment an entire community. And for the next 51 years, every new lead, every promising suspect, every technological breakthrough would circle back to the same unbearable question: who killed Carla Walker? The answer would remain hidden through changing generations, through the rise of DNA science, through countless detectives who inherited the file from those who came before them, until one revolutionary investigative metagenetic genealogy finally reached into the past and pulled a forgotten name back into the light. Fort Worth, in the mid-1970s, was a city balancing old traditions with rapid growth. Neighborhoods expanded across North Texas as families sought quiet streets and stable communities. High school football was more than entertainment. It was a ritual. Friday nights united thousands of people beneath stadium lights, where students, parents, teachers, and alumni gathered to cheer for their teams. Teenagers enjoyed freedoms that later generations would rarely experience. They met friends after games, drove around town, parked in familiar places, and returned home believing they were safe in neighborhoods where everyone seemed to know one another. Among those teenagers was Carla Jan Walker. Friends remembered her as kind, energetic, and deeply loved by those around her. She was only 17 years old, looking ahead to adulthood with the ordinary hopes shared by so many young people nearing graduation. She had plans, ambitions, and a future that appeared limitless. Those who knew her described a young woman whose life revolved around family, friends, and school. Nothing about that December evening suggested that her name would one day become synonymous with one of Texas's longest unsolved murder investigations. That night, Carla attended a local high school football game with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. After the game ended, like countless teenage couples before them, they decided to spend a little more time together before heading home. They drove to a nearby bowling alley parking lot, a familiar gathering place where young people often stopped to talk before saying goodnight. It was not an isolated wilderness. It was not some dangerous back road. It was a location that felt ordinary, comfortable, and safe. The winter air settled quietly around the parked vehicle. The stadium crowds had begun to disperse. Traffic slowly faded into the distance. For Carla and Rodney, the evening still felt routine. They talked inside the car, unaware that someone else was watching from the darkness. Then everything changed in seconds. Without warning, a man approached the vehicle carrying a handgun. His arrival was sudden, violent, and completely unexpected. Rodney later described the terrifying encounter in interviews and testimony that would become central to the investigation. The gunman ordered him out of the car. There was no opportunity to react, no chance to escape. The attacker was in complete control almost immediately. Rodney complied. The armed man struck him with the weapon, knocking him to the ground. As Rodney struggled to recover, the attacker forced Carla from the vehicle. Despite Rodney's desperate attempts to intervene, the gunman overpowered him. Helpless and injured, he watched as Carla was forced into another vehicle before the kidnapper disappeared into the darkness. It happened astonishingly fast. One ordinary evening transformed into every family's worst nightmare. Rodney immediately sought help. Law enforcement officers responded quickly, recognizing the seriousness of an apparent abduction. Patrol units searched nearby roads. Officers questioned witnesses. Detectives raced against time, hoping the victim might still be alive. Kidnapping investigations are always governed by one terrifying reality: every passing minute matters. As the first hours slipped away, investigators worked with limited information. Rodney could describe the attack, but it had unfolded so rapidly that identifying details about the suspect remained frustratingly incomplete. Darkness, stress, fear, and violence combined to blur critical observations. The attacker had vanished almost as suddenly as he had appeared. Search efforts intensified. Friends, family members, volunteers, and police hoped Carla might somehow be found alive. Instead, 2 days later, the investigation entered its darkest chapter. On December 19th, Carla Walker's body was discovered in a culvert near Benbrook Lake southwest of Fort Worth. The remote location immediately suggested that the killer had intentionally chosen an area where discovery might be delayed. Investigators secured the scene while forensic specialists carefully documented every piece of physical evidence available. The findings were devastating. Carla had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. The violence inflicted upon her shocked even experienced investigators accustomed to difficult homicide scenes. Detectives immediately recognized they were confronting an offender capable of extraordinary brutality. The emotional impact spread rapidly throughout Fort Worth. Parents who had allowed their teenagers independence suddenly questioned everything. Students returned to school carrying grief and fear instead of excitement about the approaching Christmas holiday. News reports dominated local headlines. The murder of a teenage girl kidnapped from a public parking lot shattered assumptions about safety across the community. Investigators faced enormous pressure. The public demanded answers. The Walker family deserved justice. But despite the urgency surrounding the case, identifying the killer proved extraordinarily difficult. Crime scene investigators collected biological evidence, fingerprints where possible, photographs, fibers, and every available forensic sample. Yet forensic science in 1974 operated under severe limitations compared with modern capabilities. DNA profiling had not yet entered criminal investigations. Genetic genealogy did not exist. Computers capable of rapidly comparing evidence were decades away. Detectives instead relied heavily upon traditional investigative techniques. Witness interviews, neighborhood canvasses, vehicle descriptions, known offenders, confessions, tips from the public. Thousands of investigative hours quickly accumulated. Rodney McCoy became one of the investigation's most important witnesses. From the beginning, detectives examined every aspect of his account, not because they believed he was responsible, but because investigators must verify every statement in a homicide investigation. His version remained consistent. Physical evidence supported the occurrence of an armed abduction. No evidence emerged connecting him to Carla's murder. Attention shifted elsewhere. Investigators interviewed registered offenders, violent criminals, and individuals known to frequent the area. Every possible lead generated additional interviews. Some appeared promising. None produced an arrest. As weeks became months, the investigation expanded beyond Fort Worth. Authorities considered whether Carla's killer might have committed similar crimes elsewhere in Texas or neighboring states. Detectives reviewed reports involving kidnappings, sexual assaults, and murders sharing similar characteristics. Patterns were difficult to establish. Information systems during the 1970s lacked today's nationwide databases. Detectives often depended upon mailed reports, telephone conversations, and personal contacts with agencies hundreds of miles away. Even when similarities existed, proving connections remained enormously challenging. Meanwhile, Carla's family entered an entirely different kind of struggle. Media attention gradually faded. The holiday season ended. A life moved forward for everyone else. But for those who loved Carla, time stopped. Birthdays arrived without celebration. At Christmas returned carrying memories instead of joy. Every year that passed without an arrest deepened the pain left behind by unanswered questions. Across America, countless homicide investigations eventually lose momentum. Witnesses relocate. Memories fade. Evidence deteriorates. Investigators retire. Some pass away. Cold cases often become victims of time itself. The Carla Walker investigation risks suffering the same fate. Boxes filled with reports multiplied. Evidence was carefully preserved. Photographs yellowed with age. Handwritten notes accumulated beside crime scene diagrams. Each generation of detectives inherited not only the files, but also the responsibility of solving a murder that had haunted Fort Worth since 1974. The investigation refused to disappear entirely. Periodically, renewed public interest produced additional tips. Television programs highlighted unsolved crimes. Newspaper anniversaries reminded readers that Carla's killer remained unidentified. And someone always claimed to know something. Someone always remembered a suspicious individual. As someone always offered a theory. Detectives followed each lead. One after another, they reached dead ends. As forensic science evolved during the 1980s and 1990s, hope briefly returned. DNA profiling revolutionized criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Evidence collected decades earlier could sometimes identify offenders with remarkable precision. The Carla Walker investigation benefited from careful evidence preservation. Crime scene materials collected in 1974 had been maintained despite the passing decades. Yet that decision would eventually prove invaluable. Yet early DNA testing produced only limited progress. Investigators developed genetic profiles from preserved biological evidence, but no match appeared within existing criminal databases. The unknown offender had either never submitted DNA through previous criminal convictions or simply remained absent from searchable systems. The profile existed. The killer's identity did not. Another decade passed. Then another. Children born after Carla's murder became adults. Some detectives assigned to the original investigation retired long before seeing meaningful progress. Others never lived to witness the case's eventual breakthrough. Still, the evidence remained. Waiting. Silent. Patient. As if the crime scene itself refused to surrender its final secret. The question haunted everyone connected to the investigation. Could a murderer truly vanish forever? Or was the answer already hidden inside the evidence, waiting for science to catch up with history? By the late 2010s, investigators across the United States were witnessing something remarkable. A revolutionary technique known as forensic genetic genealogy had begun solving cases once considered permanently unsolvable. It combined traditional DNA analysis with publicly available family tree research, allowing investigators to identify suspects through distant biological relatives rather than direct database matches. The method had already transformed several major cold cases, proving that decades-old evidence could suddenly reveal names investigators had never encountered before. For detectives assigned to Carla Walker's murder, the possibility was impossible to ignore. 50 years of frustration had taught them not to expect miracles. But this time, for the first time in generations, the evidence itself seemed ready to speak. For decades, the evidence remained locked away inside climate-controlled storage, carefully cataloged and preserved long after many believed it would ever serve another purpose. Cardboard boxes containing photographs, handwritten interview notes, forensic reports, laboratory submissions, and physical evidence became more than archival material. They became silent witnesses waiting for technology to catch up with a crime committed on a cold December night in 1974. Detectives who inherited the Carla Walker case often described the same feeling when opening those files. Every page represented extraordinary effort. Every report reflected investigators who had refused to give up despite having few answers. Yet every generation reached the same conclusion. The identity of Carla Walker's killer remained hidden somewhere beyond the reach of contemporary science. The original investigators had understood something essential from the very beginning. Even if available technology could not identify the offender, preserving every possible piece of evidence might one day allow future investigators to succeed. That decision would ultimately become one of the most important choices made during the entire investigation. Throughout the 1980s, advances in forensic science transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Fingerprint comparison became increasingly sophisticated. Crime laboratories expanded their capabilities. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA profiling emerged as one of the most powerful investigative tools ever introduced. Cases that once depended almost entirely upon eyewitness testimony suddenly possessed an objective scientific method capable of identifying individuals with extraordinary precision. Like countless cold case investigators nationwide, Fort Worth detectives revisited the Carla Walker evidence. The preserved biological material was examined using newer forensic methods unavailable in 1974. Laboratory scientists successfully developed a DNA profile believed to belong to Carla's attacker. That accomplishment represented enormous progress compared with the original investigation. But a DNA profile alone could not solve a murder. It needed a name. Investigators submitted the profile to national law enforcement databases designed to compare crime scene DNA against known offenders. The expectation was straightforward. If the killer had previously been convicted of qualifying crimes requiring DNA collection, a match might appear almost instantly. Nothing happened. No match. No suspect. No arrest. The silence was devastating. It suggested that the man responsible either had never been required to submit DNA or had somehow managed to avoid inclusion in available criminal databases. Detectives had scientific evidence proving the killer's genetic identity, yet they still had no idea who he was. The investigation entered another frustrating chapter. Years continued to pass. Every anniversary of Carla's murder renewed public attention. Local newspapers revisited the case. Television stations aired interviews with investigators hoping someone might finally recognize a forgotten detail. The Fort Worth Police Department never officially closed the file. Detectives continued reviewing evidence whenever new forensic developments emerged. The Walker family carried an emotional burden impossible to measure. Justice delayed does not lessen grief. It simply extends it. Every milestone in life became another reminder of what had been stolen. The decades that followed transformed nearly every aspect of American society. New neighborhoods replaced old fields, roads expanded, businesses closed. Teenagers who had attended that football game in 1974 became parents and grandparents. Some witnesses died, others moved away. Memories inevitably faded. But one thing remained unchanged. Carla Walker's killer had never been identified. Across the country, however, another story was quietly unfolding. Cold cases once considered impossible began falling with astonishing speed. Investigators in several jurisdictions started using an entirely different approach to DNA evidence. Instead of limiting comparisons to law enforcement databases, they explored the emerging field of forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA matching, this method searched for biological relatives whose DNA had been voluntarily submitted to genealogy databases used for family history research. The concept sounded almost unbelievable. A suspect no longer needed to submit his own DNA. Instead, investigators could identify distant cousins, reconstruct enormous family trees, eliminate unrelated branches, narrow possible candidates through age, geography, and historical records, and eventually identify one individual whose life matched the available evidence. The process demanded patience rather than luck. Professional genealogists worked alongside detectives. Public records became investigative tools. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, military records, census information, newspaper archives. Every document added another branch to an expanding family tree. Success depended upon combining meticulous historical research with modern genetic science. The method first captured worldwide attention when investigators identified the man responsible for the Golden State Killer crimes in California. That breakthrough fundamentally changed how detectives viewed cold cases everywhere. Suddenly, investigations abandoned for decades looked solvable again. Departments across the United States began reviewing unsolved murders involving preserved DNA evidence. Fort Worth investigators carefully observed those developments. The Carla Walker case possessed exactly what this revolutionary method required. It preserved biological evidence, a complete DNA profile, an unidentified offender. The opportunity was too significant to ignore. Detectives decided to pursue forensic genetic genealogy. The process did not begin with dramatic arrests or sensational discoveries. It began inside laboratories. Scientists generated a DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison, using specialized techniques different from traditional criminal database analysis. The objective was not to identify the suspect directly, but to identify people sharing portions of inherited DNA. Those individuals were not suspects, and most had never heard of Carla Walker. Many had no idea their family histories would become part of a homicide investigation. Their voluntarily submitted DNA simply revealed distant biological relationships that investigators could legally analyze under applicable policies and warrants where required. The first results offered cautious optimism. There were relatives, not close family members, not siblings, not children, more distant connections, third cousins, fourth cousins, people sharing ancestors generations earlier. At first glance, the information appeared almost useless. How could distant relatives possibly identify a murderer after nearly half a century? Yet experienced genetic genealogists understood precisely where to begin. Every family tree starts somewhere. Researchers documented one ancestral couple, and another. Each branch expanded. The children became parents. Grandchildren multiplied. Entire family networks spread across multiple states. Thousands of names eventually emerged. Most could be eliminated immediately. Wrong age. Wrong gender. Impossible locations. Branches disconnected from Texas. Slowly, methodically, the enormous tree became smaller. Investigators combined genealogy with conventional police work. Historical addresses. Employment records. Vehicle registrations. Military service. Educational histories. Marriage records. Everything mattered. Every verified fact narrowed possibilities further. Unlike television crime dramas, this work unfolded over months rather than hours. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden confessions. Instead, researchers spent countless hours comparing historical documents, correcting mistaken family records, verifying biological relationships, and reconstructing lives extending back generations. Detectives exercised extraordinary caution. A mistaken identification could permanently damage innocent families. Every conclusion required independent verification. Every assumption demanded supporting evidence. Eventually, attention focused upon one particular family line. Within that branch appeared several male descendants whose ages aligned with the timeline of the murder. One individual attracted increasing investigative interest. His name was Randy Miller. At first, investigators knew only that his age made him a possible candidate. That alone proved nothing. Hundreds of men matched similar demographic characteristics. The investigation therefore shifted from genealogy back toward traditional detective work. Who was Randy Miller? Where had he lived? Had he been in Fort Worth during December 1974? Did his background intersect with the evidence? Historical research revealed that Miller had lived in the area during the relevant period. That finding immediately elevated investigative interest. Still, presence alone established nothing. Detectives continued gathering information without alerting him. They reviewed publicly available records, employment histories, residential addresses, previous interactions with law enforcement. Nothing could be assumed. The investigation required objective evidence, not coincidence. As detectives assembled a fuller picture, they recognized another crucial step remained. Genealogical analysis could identify likely candidates. It could not prove guilt. Only a direct DNA comparison between Randy Miller and the biological evidence preserved from Carla Walker's murder could answer the central question. Investigators therefore developed a surveillance strategy consistent with established legal procedures. If Miller truly was the unknown contributor, obtaining a lawfully collected discarded DNA sample might provide confirmation without immediate confrontation. Across countless criminal investigations, discarded items have legally supplied DNA evidence. A drinking cup, a tissue, a cigarette, a bottle. Objects abandoned in public often contain biological material suitable for laboratory comparison. Investigators watched carefully, patiently, quietly. They understood the enormous significance of what might soon occur. If laboratory scientists confirmed a match, one of Texas's oldest unsolved murders could finally move toward resolution. If the DNA excluded Miller, investigators would return to the family tree and begin again. Weeks of surveillance unfolded without public attention. The Walker family knew little about the extraordinary progress occurring behind the scenes. The community remained unaware that detectives might finally be standing within reach of an answer that had eluded generations. Inside forensic laboratories, anticipation grew. Scientists prepared for comparisons that could end more than 4 decades of uncertainty. Every procedural safeguard was followed. Chain of custody, laboratory verification, independent review. Accuracy mattered more than speed. The consequences of error were unthinkable. Detectives who had spent years studying the case understood the emotional weight carried by every new development. They remembered the disappointment of previous promising leads. False hopes had become familiar companions. Nobody wanted another dead end. Nobody wanted to tell Carla's family that the investigation had once again reached nothing. So they waited, carefully, methodically, confident only in the evidence itself. Somewhere inside those preserved biological samples lay the truth that had survived half a century. If science had finally caught up with history, the next laboratory report would not simply identify a suspect. It would bridge 51 years. It would connect a terrified teenage girl abducted from a parking lot in 1974 with a living man who had spent decades believing he had escaped justice. And for the first time since Carla Walker disappeared into the darkness on that December night, investigators could almost see the outline of the answer they had spent generations searching for. The investigation had reached a point where optimism alone was dangerous. Detectives working cold cases understood that some of the most promising leads in history had ultimately collapsed under scientific scrutiny. Family trees could point in the right direction. Witness statements could appear convincing. Circumstantial evidence could raise suspicion. But none of it mattered if the DNA did not agree. After more than 4 decades of unanswered questions, the Carla Walker investigation depended upon one simple comparison. Did the biological evidence recovered in December 1974 belong to Randy Miller, or did it belong to someone else entirely? Investigators proceeded with extraordinary caution. They did not rush to make an arrest. They did not notify the media. They did not contact Miller for an interview. Instead, they continued building their case exactly as detectives are trained to do quietly, methodically, and without revealing that the investigation had taken a dramatic turn. Surveillance teams observed Miller's daily routine. Every movement was documented. Every opportunity to lawfully obtain a discarded DNA sample was carefully considered. The objective was straightforward. If investigators could recover an item that Miller had voluntarily abandoned in a public place, forensic scientists could compare that DNA to the profile developed from the preserved evidence in Carla Walker's murder. The process required patience. Days passed. Then more days. Investigators resisted the temptation to move too quickly. After waiting more than 40 years, another week or two made little difference if it ensured every legal and scientific requirement would withstand scrutiny. Eventually, detectives obtained a discarded item believed to contain Miller's DNA. The evidence was submitted to the laboratory under strict chain of custody procedures. From that moment forward, the investigation entered another waiting period. Unlike television dramas, forensic testing is rarely instantaneous. Laboratory scientists must carefully extract DNA, generate reliable profiles, verify quality, conduct comparisons, and confirm results through established protocols. Every stage exists for one reason: to ensure that scientific conclusions can withstand examination in court. For detectives assigned to the case, every passing day felt unusually long. No matter how experienced they were, they understood what was at stake. If the DNA matched, one of Texas's oldest unsolved murders would finally have a suspect. If it failed to match, years of genealogical research would collapse, and investigators would have to return to the beginning of the family tree. Then the laboratory completed its analysis. The comparison produced the answer investigators had been seeking for decades. The DNA profile obtained from Randy Miller was consistent with the biological evidence preserved from Carla Walker's murder. The significance of that finding cannot be overstated. This was not merely another investigative lead. It was a scientific connection between a living individual and evidence collected at the crime scene in 1974. For detectives who had inherited the case from earlier generations, the result represented something many had begun to wonder if they would ever experience. The investigation finally had a name. But even then, the work was not finished. A DNA match alone does not automatically conclude a homicide investigation. Detectives still had to review every available piece of evidence, reconstruct historical timelines, and prepare a comprehensive case capable of withstanding prosecution decades after the crime occurred. That challenge was considerable. 46 years had passed. Some witnesses had died. Others remembered events only imperfectly. Documents had aged. Investigators who originally worked the case had long since retired, and some were no longer alive to explain the reasoning behind decisions made in the 1970s. The modern investigative team therefore undertook the painstaking task of reconstructing the original investigation from surviving records. Thousands of pages were reviewed again. Original crime scene photographs were re-examined. Evidence logs were checked. Interview transcripts were analyzed. Nothing could be overlooked simply because decades had passed. At the same time, detectives began assembling a detailed history of Randy Miller's life. Where had he lived? Where had he worked? Did his known movements place him in Fort Worth during December 1974? Historical records indicated that he had indeed lived in the area at the relevant time. That finding aligned with the genetic genealogy investigation. Still, prosecutors required more than alignment. Every fact had to fit together independently. Investigators also revisited Rodney McCoy's original account of the abduction. His description of the attack had remained remarkably consistent over the decades. He had described an armed man approaching the vehicle, forcing him out at gunpoint, striking him, and abducting Carla before fleeing. Although the darkness and speed of the encounter limited his ability to identify the attacker, nothing in his testimony conflicted with the developing evidence. His account remained an essential part of the case. For Rodney, the passage of time had never erased that night. He had lived with memories that no one would willingly carry. In interviews given years later, he described the lasting emotional burden of surviving an attack that claimed the life of someone he cared deeply about. The passage of decades had not diminished those memories. If anything, the unanswered questions had made them heavier. Meanwhile, investigators examined whether Randy Miller might be connected to other violent crimes. Cold case detectives frequently ask an unavoidable question when identifying suspects decades later. Was this an isolated offense? Or was it part of a larger pattern? Authorities reviewed available records and compared information with other agencies where appropriate. Publicly available information has not established that Miller was responsible for additional homicides, and investigators focus primarily on building the strongest possible case concerning Carla Walker's murder. The evidence in that case was substantial enough. As detectives prepared their findings, they coordinated closely with prosecutors. The age of the case presented unusual legal challenges. Evidence collected under 1974 standards had to be carefully explained within a modern courtroom. Scientific techniques unavailable during the original investigation now formed a central part of the prosecution's evidence. Experts prepared to explain forensic genetic genealogy not as proof of guilt by itself, but as an investigative method that led detectives to a suspect whose identity was then confirmed through direct DNA comparison. That distinction was critical. Genetic genealogy generated the lead. A direct DNA comparison supplied the evidentiary link. The investigation had followed both scientific rigor and traditional police work. By the summer of 2020, authorities believed they had sufficient evidence to seek an arrest. The decision carried enormous emotional weight. Nearly half a century had passed since Carla Walker was kidnapped. Many people had stopped believing the case would ever be solved. Some of the detectives who devoted years of their careers to the investigation never lived to see this moment. The Walker family had endured decades of uncertainty. Now, investigators prepared to tell them that the search for Carla's killer had finally reached its conclusion. On September 22, SIL 2020, law enforcement officers arrested Randy Miller. He was charged with the capital murder of Carla Walker. The announcement sent shockwaves through Fort Worth and across the nation. For younger generations, the case represented another remarkable example of modern forensic science solving a historic crime. For those who remembered 1974, it was something far more personal. A nightmare that had lingered for nearly 50 years had suddenly returned to the headlines. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers revisited photographs many readers had not seen in decades. Former investigators reflected on the extraordinary breakthrough. Cold case specialists across the country studied the investigation as another demonstration of what preserved evidence and emerging technology could accomplish together. For Carla's family, however, the arrest was not simply a scientific success. It marked the beginning of a different emotional journey, relief mixed with grief. Answers arrived alongside memories they had spent decades trying to carry. No arrest could restore the life stolen in 1974. Justice and healing are not identical. One addresses accountability. The other remains deeply personal. Investigators also understood that an arrest is not a conviction. If the legal process still lay ahead, defense attorneys would examine the evidence. Scientific methods would be challenged. Witnesses would testify. Experts would explain DNA analysis, evidence preservation, and genealogical investigation before a jury. The burden of proof remained exactly where it had always belonged. on the prosecution. Still, one undeniable fact had changed forever. The Carla Walker murder was no longer a nameless mystery. The unknown attacker who had disappeared into the darkness after abducting a 17-year-old girl from a Fort Worth parking lot finally had an identity attached to the evidence. The cold case that had haunted generations of detectives had crossed an invisible line. For nearly 5 decades, investigators had asked who committed the crime. And now they faced a different question. Could they prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in a courtroom, despite the extraordinary passage of time? That challenge would test not only the strength of modern forensic science, but also the endurance of evidence preserved since the winter of 1974, when a community lost one of its daughters and unknowingly began waiting nearly half a century for justice. The arrest of Randy Miller marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the story. For investigators, it was a moment of vindication. For Carla Walker's family, it was a moment of overwhelming emotion. For prosecutors, however, it signaled the beginning of an entirely different challenge. Solving a cold case and proving that case before a jury decades later are not the same task. The evidence had survived. The suspect had been identified. Now every decision made since December 1974 would be examined under the unforgiving standards of a criminal courtroom. The announcement of Miller's arrest immediately drew national attention. News organizations across the United States highlighted the extraordinary breakthrough, emphasizing that the case had been solved through forensic genetic genealogy, one of the newest and most influential investigative techniques in modern criminal justice. The public saw another example of science reaching backward through time, finding a man who had lived freely for decades while investigators quietly preserved the evidence that would eventually identify him. For many people in Fort Worth, the headlines reopened memories that had never completely disappeared. Residents who had lived through the 1970s remembered the fear that followed Carla's abduction. Parents recalled how quickly everyday routines had changed after her murder. Teenagers who had once gathered in parking lots after football games remembered how that simple freedom suddenly carried a new sense of danger. Carla's case had become more than an unsolved homicide. It had become part of the city's collective memory. The arrest also renewed interest in the original investigation. Former detectives who had worked portions of the case reflected publicly on the enormous obstacles they had faced. In 1974, there was no DNA profiling. There were no computerized criminal databases capable of linking evidence across jurisdictions. There were no genealogy databases connecting distant relatives through shared genetic markers. Investigators relied upon interviews, witness recollections, physical evidence, and persistence. They had collected everything they could. What they lacked was not determination. It was technology. That distinction mattered. Cold cases are often misunderstood. When an investigation remains unsolved for decades, people sometimes assume detectives failed to pursue important leads or overlooked critical evidence. In reality, many cold cases remain unsolved simply because the available scientific tools of the time cannot answer the questions investigators are asking. Carla Walker's case became one of the clearest demonstrations of that reality. Detectives had preserved evidence carefully enough that future science, not future luck, could finally identify the suspect. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they organized evidence spanning nearly half a century. Original crime scene photographs remained central to the case. Laboratory reports from multiple decades had to be reviewed and explained. Historical investigative notes documented the progression of the original inquiry. Modern forensic analyses demonstrated how preserved biological evidence eventually led investigators toward Randy Miller. Experts prepared detailed reports explaining the distinction between investigative genealogy and evidentiary DNA testing. This distinction would become one of the most important aspects of the prosecution. Forensic genetic genealogy did not itself prove that Miller committed the crime. Instead, it generated an investigative led by identifying relatives whose publicly available DNA profiles suggested a possible family connection. Detectives then constructed family trees, narrowed potential candidates, and ultimately focused on Miller. Only after that process did investigators obtain a DNA sample for direct comparison. That comparison, not genealogy alone, provided the scientific evidence presented in court. The prosecution anticipated that jurors would need to understand this sequence clearly. Scientific innovation often appears mysterious to people encountering it for the first time. Expert witnesses therefore prepared to explain complex genetic principles using clear language supported by established forensic methodology. Every step of the investigation would need to be transparent. Meanwhile, the defense prepared its own strategy. In any criminal prosecution, the accused is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That principle remains fundamental regardless of how old the case may be or how emotionally powerful the evidence appears. Defense attorneys carefully examined every stage of the investigation. They reviewed chain of custody records. They analyzed laboratory procedures. They evaluated witness testimony collected decades earlier. They considered how the extraordinary passage of time might affect memories, documentation, and interpretation of evidence. These are ordinary and expected aspects of the criminal justice process. Cases built upon decades-old evidence require especially careful examination because witnesses may no longer be available, investigators may have retired or died, and historical records must speak for themselves. The courtroom would therefore become the place where scientific evidence, historical investigation, and legal procedure intersected. Outside the courthouse, Carla's family confronted emotions that had accumulated over nearly 50 years. An arrest can answer one question while raising many others. Why Carla? Why that night? Had the suspect lived an ordinary life while carrying knowledge of the crime? Had anyone ever suspected him? Those questions reflected the emotional reality experienced by many families whose loved ones are victims of long unsolved murders. Justice arrives. Time does not return. For Rodney McCoy, the trial represented another opportunity to revisit events that had shaped his entire adult life. The violent attack outside the bowling alley had lasted only moments. Its consequences had lasted decades. His recollections remained an important part of the historical narrative surrounding the investigation. Although modern forensic evidence now occupied the center of the prosecution's case, Rodney's testimony continued to establish the sequence of events leading to Carla's abduction. He had survived. Carla had not. That difference became the defining reality of both their lives. The investigation also demonstrated another important lesson shared by many successful cold case prosecutions. Evidence preservation matters. When detectives in 1974 carefully collected biological evidence, they could not have imagined forensic genetic genealogy. They could not foresee DNA databases. They could not predict laboratory techniques that would emerge decades later. Yet they preserved the evidence anyway. That professional discipline ultimately transformed what appeared to be an unsolvable murder into a prosecutable case. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies took notice. Cold case units reviewed older investigations with renewed optimism. Evidence once considered scientifically exhausted suddenly became valuable again. Departments invested additional resources into unsolved homicides. Forensic laboratories expanded their capabilities. Genealogists began working alongside detectives more frequently than ever before. The Carla Walker investigation became part of a broader transformation occurring throughout criminal justice. Science was changing the limits of possibility. Cases abandoned by time were returning to active investigation. Families who had spent decades believing they would never receive answers began receiving unexpected phone calls from detectives. Some learned arrests had been made. Others learned investigations had been reopened because preserved evidence could finally be analyzed using techniques unavailable when the crimes occurred. The Walker case therefore represented more than a single prosecution. It became one example of how persistence, evidence preservation, and scientific innovation could converge after generations of uncertainty. Yet prosecutors remained focused upon one objective: securing a lawful conviction based upon reliable evidence. Everything else, the headlines, the technological breakthroughs, the national attention, remained secondary. Inside the courtroom, only facts mattered. Only evidence. Only testimony. Only the law. As trial preparations continued, experts refined their presentations. Forensic scientists prepared visual demonstrations explaining DNA profiling. Genealogists outlined how family trees had narrowed the suspect pool without serving as direct proof of guilt. Investigators organized decades of documentation into a coherent chronology that jurors could understand despite the extraordinary age of the case. Every exhibit would need context. Every scientific conclusion required explanation. Every historical decision demanded clarity. The challenge extended beyond proving what happened in December 1974. The prosecution also had to explain how investigators in 2020 reached the same destination through methods that simply did not exist when Carla Walker was murdered. That story reflected 50 years of scientific progress. It also reflected 50 years of patience. The evidence had never changed. Only humanity's ability to understand it had evolved. As the trial approached, one truth became increasingly apparent. The investigation had already accomplished something once considered impossible. A murder committed before DNA profiling existed had been connected to a suspect through biological evidence preserved across nearly half a century. Now, 12 ordinary citizens would ultimately decide whether that evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For Carla Walker's family, they had already waited longer than anyone should ever have to wait. The next stage would determine whether those decades of waiting would finally end with accountability inside a courtroom, where the voice of science would stand beside the silent testimony of evidence collected on a cold Texas morning in December 1974. As the prosecution prepared to present its case, the passage of time became both its greatest obstacle and one of its strongest arguments. Nearly half a century had elapsed since Carla Walker was abducted outside a Fort Worth bowling alley. Entire neighborhoods had changed. Businesses that existed in 1974 had disappeared. Roads had been widened, buildings demolished, and generations had grown up knowing the case only through newspaper archives and television documentaries. Yet despite everything that had changed, one thing had remained remarkably constant. The physical evidence collected during the original investigation had survived. It had not forgotten. Unlike memories, which fade with every passing year, the biological evidence preserved by investigators carried the same genetic information in 2020 that it had carried on the night Carla was murdered. For prosecutors, that evidence formed the foundation of the case. Unlike eyewitness testimony, DNA does not become uncertain with age. Unlike recollections, it does not confuse dates or locations. Unlike rumors, it does not grow stronger or weaker depending on who repeats the story. Scientific evidence speaks only through analysis. Its value depends upon careful collection, preservation, and interpretation. The Carla Walker investigation possessed each of those elements. That did not mean the trial would be simple. Quite the opposite. Every significant piece of evidence would be examined from multiple perspectives. Every scientific conclusion would be scrutinized. Every procedural decision made by investigators would be questioned. That is precisely how the criminal justice system is designed to function. The burden always remains with the prosecution. During pretrial proceedings, attorneys addressed numerous legal and evidentiary issues common to complex homicide prosecutions, particularly those involving decades-old investigations. The court considered questions regarding the admissibility of forensic evidence, expert testimony, and investigative methods. Because forensic genetic genealogy represented a relatively recent investigative development, both sides devoted careful attention to explaining exactly how it had been used. And prosecutors emphasized an important distinction. The genealogy research itself did not identify Randy Miller as guilty. It identified him as someone worthy of further investigation. Only after detectives focused on Miller did they obtain a separate DNA sample and compare it directly with the biological evidence preserved from Carla Walker's murder. That direct comparison formed the evidentiary basis supporting the prosecution. The genealogy merely pointed investigators toward a potential suspect. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, examined every stage of that process. They questioned investigative procedures. They reviewed laboratory documentation. They analyzed the handling of evidence over nearly 5 decades. These challenges reflected ordinary legal practice rather than unusual controversy. When evidence has existed for decades, courts carefully evaluate whether it has been properly preserved and whether scientific conclusions satisfy established standards of reliability. The integrity of the judicial process depends upon that examination. As preparations continued, the prosecution also revisited the original timeline established in December 1974. Carla and Rodney attended a high school football game. Afterward, they drove to the bowling alley parking lot. An armed man approached, and Rodney was assaulted. Carla was abducted. 2 days later, her body was discovered near Benbrook Lake. That sequence had remained unchanged from the earliest stages of the investigation. Modern forensic science had not rewritten history. It had simply provided investigators with a means of identifying the person responsible, and witnesses who remained available, prepared to testify. Their memories alone could not establish guilt after so many years, but they helped provide context for jurors unfamiliar with the events of 1974. Photographs from the original crime scene illustrated the investigation as it unfolded. Contemporaneous reports documented observations made before anyone knew whose DNA had been collected. This chronological separation strengthened the prosecution's presentation. The evidence had existed long before Randy Miller became a suspect. Nothing had been created after investigators identified him. The biological evidence had waited patiently through decades of scientific progress until technology became capable of revealing its significance. Cold case investigators often describe preserved evidence as a silent witness. That description seemed especially appropriate here. The evidence had remained unchanged while detectives changed. Laboratories changed. Technology changed. Even the legal landscape evolved. Yet the biological material collected in 1974 continued to carry the same information, unaffected by the passing years. Outside the courtroom, public interest intensified. News organizations revisited the investigation in detail. Many younger viewers encountered Carla Walker's story for the first time. Others remembered reading about the case when they were children. The extraordinary length of time between the crime and the arrest fascinated audiences across the country. Forensic genetic genealogy had already attracted considerable attention following other successful cold case investigations. The Walker case further demonstrated that preserved evidence could remain valuable far longer than previously imagined. The renewed media attention also prompted broader discussions about unsolved homicides. Across the United States, thousands of murder investigations remain open despite decades of investigative effort. Many involve preserved biological evidence. Many now receive renewed examination as forensic science continues advancing. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize that cases once considered impossible may simply have been waiting for the right technology. The Walker investigation became one example among many illustrating that principle. For the Walker family, however, these broader discussions remained secondary. Public attention inevitably focused upon scientific breakthroughs. The family remained focused upon Carla. Every court appearance, every legal filing, every media report represented another reminder of the daughter, sister, and loved one whose future ended in December 1974. And the emotional burden extended beyond waiting for justice. It included reliving painful memories each time the case returned to public attention. That reality often accompanies cold case prosecutions. The legal process revives tragedies that families have spent years trying to survive. At the same time, investigators reflected on colleagues who had not lived to witness the arrest. The original case involved numerous officers, detectives, forensic specialists, and prosecutors whose work laid the foundation for the eventual breakthrough. Many retired decades earlier. Some died before forensic genetic genealogy transformed cold case investigations. Their contributions nevertheless remained essential. Without careful crime scene documentation, without evidence preservation, without meticulous record-keeping, modern science would have had nothing to examine. The successful identification of Randy Miller therefore represented not only a triumph of contemporary technology, but also a testament to the professionalism of investigators working in 1974. As the trial approached, expert witnesses refined their explanations of DNA science. Jurors would need to understand concepts that had never existed when the crime occurred. How are DNA profiles generated? How reliable are direct DNA comparisons? What distinguishes genealogical investigation from evidentiary testing? Why does preserved biological evidence remain scientifically useful after decades? Each question required clear, accurate answers grounded in accepted forensic practice. The prosecution recognized that scientific complexity must never become scientific confusion. Jurors do not need advanced genetics degrees to evaluate evidence. They need understandable explanations supported by credible experts and careful methodology. The defense retained its own experts where appropriate and continued evaluating the prosecution's scientific conclusions. Such scrutiny is an expected part of adversarial legal proceedings. Reliable forensic evidence should withstand rigorous examination regardless of which side conducts it. Confidence in criminal convictions depends upon precisely that process. By now, the Carla Walker investigation had become more than a local homicide case. Law enforcement agencies nationwide observed the proceedings closely. Cold case detectives studied investigative timelines. And prosecutors reviewed legal strategies. Forensic laboratories examined methodological questions. The case offered valuable lessons extending well beyond Fort Worth. How should evidence be preserved? How should genealogical leads be documented? How should investigators balance emerging technology with established evidentiary standards? These questions would influence future investigations long after Carla Walker's case concluded. Still, beneath every scientific discussion and legal argument remained a profoundly human story. A 17-year-old young woman had left a football game expecting to return home. But she never did. Her family spent nearly 50 years waiting for answers. Her boyfriend carried the memory of a violent attack that unfolded in moments but shaped an entire lifetime. Detectives devoted years of their careers to an investigation they sometimes feared would never be solved. Science eventually supplied what determination alone could not. Yet even as the courtroom prepared to hear decades of evidence, one truth remained impossible to ignore. No conviction, if one were ultimately secured, could restore the life interrupted on that December night. Justice could identify responsibility. It could not erase loss. That distinction remained at the heart of the case. Every exhibit introduced into evidence. Every witness called to testify. Every scientific explanation offered before the jury. All of it ultimately served one purpose: to answer, through lawful process and reliable evidence, the question that had haunted Fort Worth since 1974: who abducted and murdered Carla Walker? And could the evidence preserved across nearly half a century finally establish that answer beyond a reasonable doubt? When the trial finally moved forward, it carried with it far more than the weight of a single criminal prosecution. It represented the culmination of nearly 5 decades of investigative work, scientific advancement, and unwavering persistence. Inside the courtroom, the calendar no longer read 1974. It was almost half a century later. Yet every witness, every photograph, every piece of physical evidence transported jurors back to a December night when a 17-year-old girl disappeared after what should have been an ordinary date. Unlike many homicide trials, this one unfolded against an extraordinary historical backdrop. The jurors were being asked to evaluate evidence collected before personal computers were common, before DNA profiling existed, and before forensic genetic genealogy had even been imagined. The challenge was not simply to determine whether the evidence was persuasive. It was to understand how investigators had bridged nearly 50 years using methods separated by generations of scientific progress. Prosecutors began by reconstructing the events of December 17, 1974. Their presentation followed the timeline established almost immediately after Carla Walker disappeared. The football game. The drive to the bowling alley parking lot. The sudden appearance of an armed attacker. The assault on Rodney McCoy. The abduction. The desperate search. The discovery of Carla's body 2 days later. These facts had never changed. Long before anyone knew the identity of the suspect, detectives had documented the sequence of events with remarkable care. Original reports written in the hours and days following the crime formed an essential foundation of the prosecution's case. They demonstrated that investigators had consistently understood the nature of the offense from the very beginning. Crime scene photographs followed. Jurors examined images recorded by investigators in 1974. These were not dramatic recreations. They were historical records. Every photograph documented conditions exactly as investigators encountered them. Every measurement reflected procedures carried out decades before Randy Miller's name ever entered the investigation. The prosecution emphasized this chronology repeatedly. Nothing about the physical evidence had been created to support a modern theory. It had existed since the earliest days of the investigation. The scientific interpretation had evolved. The evidence itself had not. Forensic experts then explained how biological evidence collected during the original investigation had been preserved. Jurors learned about chain of custody procedures, evidence packaging, laboratory storage, documentation requirements. Each transfer of evidence had been recorded according to established protocols. Their preservation became one of the central themes of the trial. Without meticulous handling in 1974, no amount of modern science could have solved the case. The prosecution next introduced testimony explaining DNA analysis. Experts described how forensic laboratories generated DNA profiles from preserved biological material. Rather than overwhelming jurors with technical terminology, witnesses focused upon fundamental principles. Every person possesses a unique genetic profile, with the exception of identical twins. Biological evidence recovered from crime scenes can therefore identify or exclude individuals when suitable samples exist. The laboratory had developed a DNA profile from evidence collected during the investigation. Years later, that profile became the basis for comparisons unavailable in 1974. The courtroom then turned to forensic genetic genealogy. Because many jurors had likely heard about the technique through media coverage of other cold cases, prosecutors carefully distinguished between genealogy and direct forensic identification. An expert explained that genealogy functions as an investigative tool rather than direct proof. It searches for biological relatives whose voluntarily submitted DNA reveals possible family connections. Those relationships allow genealogists to reconstruct extensive family trees. Investigators then eliminate branches inconsistent with age, geography, or other known facts. Eventually, one or more possible candidates emerge. The expert emphasized that genealogy does not determine guilt. It simply provides investigators with names deserving closer examination. Only after detectives focused on Randy Miller did they seek a direct DNA comparison. That comparison, not the genealogy itself, formed the evidentiary basis connecting Miller to the preserved biological evidence. The distinction proved essential. The genealogy pointed investigators toward Miller. The laboratory comparison linked his DNA to evidence recovered during the murder investigation. Detectives assigned to the case described how they received genealogical information and then returned to traditional police work. Historical records were reviewed. Residences were confirmed. Timelines were reconstructed. Surveillance was conducted. Eventually, investigators lawfully obtained a discarded DNA sample associated with Miller. That sample was submitted for laboratory comparison. The resulting analysis established the direct genetic correspondence presented to the jury. As prosecutors built their case, they also called witnesses capable of describing the original investigation. Although many individuals involved in 1974 were no longer available to testify, surviving records preserved their observations. Reports prepared immediately after the crime documented investigative decisions made long before DNA technology existed. Those records carried considerable evidentiary value because they reflected contemporaneous observations rather than recollections shaped by passing decades. Rodney McCoy's testimony remained emotionally significant. He described the ordinary evening that transformed into unimaginable violence. He recounted the sudden appearance of the armed man, the assault, Carla's abduction, his desperate but unsuccessful attempt to intervene. His testimony reminded jurors that behind every scientific exhibit stood real people whose lives had been permanently altered. For Rodney, the events had never truly ended. The attack lasted minutes. Its consequences endured for decades. The defense cross-examined witnesses in accordance with standard criminal procedure. Questions addressed the reliability of historical evidence, the passage of time, investigative methods, scientific interpretation. These exchanges reflected the adversarial process designed to test every significant aspect of the prosecution's case. No criminal conviction should rest upon unchallenged assumptions. Evidence gains strength by surviving scrutiny. Expert witnesses likewise answered questions regarding laboratory procedures. They explained quality control measures, independent verification, established forensic standards, scientific reporting requirements. Jurors were reminded repeatedly that DNA analysis follows standardized methodologies developed through decades of research and validation. The prosecution also acknowledged an unavoidable reality. No eyewitness had identified Randy Miller during the original investigation. The crime occurred quickly. Darkness limited observation. The attacker had not remained at the scene. The prosecution did not attempt to overstate eyewitness evidence. Instead, it relied upon the preserved biological evidence and the investigative path leading from genealogy to direct DNA confirmation. That approach reflected both honesty and confidence. Rather than stretching historical testimony beyond its limits, prosecutors allowed the scientific evidence to speak for itself. Outside the courthouse, the trial continued attracting widespread attention. Journalists reported daily developments. Legal analysts discussed the significance of forensic genetic genealogy. Cold case investigators from other jurisdictions followed proceedings closely. Many recognized that legal rulings emerging from the Walker case could influence future prosecutions involving decades-old evidence. Families of victims in unrelated cold cases watched with hope. If Carla Walker's murder could be prosecuted after nearly half a century, perhaps their own unanswered questions might someday receive similar attention. The broader implications extended beyond any single investigation. The trial represented an evolving relationship between science and justice. For generations, detectives had accepted that many crimes would remain permanently unsolved once enough time had passed. Modern forensic science challenged that assumption. Evidence once considered silent had become capable of revealing identities across generations. Every successful prosecution strengthened confidence that time alone need not protect offenders from accountability. Still, inside the courtroom, the focus remained appropriately narrow. The jury's responsibility was not to evaluate the future of forensic science. It was to determine whether the evidence presented established Randy Miller's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Every witness, every document, every scientific explanation, every procedural safeguard, all existed for that single purpose. As testimony continued, one impression became increasingly difficult to ignore. The investigation had not succeeded because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten detail. It had not depended upon an unexpected confession or a fortunate coincidence. It had succeeded because detectives in 1974 preserved evidence with exceptional care, and investigators decades later refused to abandon the search for answers. The bridge between those two generations was built by science. But the foundation had been laid on the very first days of the investigation, when officers at a remote crime scene carefully collected evidence without knowing that future technology would one day transform it into the voice of a witness that had remained silent for nearly 50 years. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's case increasingly centered on a simple but powerful principle. Physical evidence does not experience fear. It does not forget details. It does not change its account after repeated questioning. While memories naturally fade and witnesses grow older, properly preserved forensic evidence remains exactly as it was when collected. Nearly 50 years after Carla Walker's murder, that principle became the prosecution's strongest ally. Jurors had now heard weeks of testimony explaining the evolution of the investigation. They understood how detectives in 1974 documented the crime scene, how biological evidence had been preserved despite the technological limitations of the era, and how modern forensic genetic genealogy eventually generated a lead that directed investigators toward Randy Miller. The prosecution argued that every stage of the investigation formed part of one continuous chain, stretching from the original crime scene to the eventual arrest in 2020. That continuity mattered. If even one critical link in the chain had failed, the prosecution's case would become significantly weaker. Evidence had to be properly collected, properly stored, properly documented, properly analyzed, properly compared. The jury was repeatedly reminded that scientific conclusions are only as reliable as the procedures supporting them. Forensic experts returned to explain additional aspects of DNA analysis. They discussed statistical interpretation without overwhelming jurors with unnecessary complexity. Rather than presenting science as mysterious or infallible, they described it as a disciplined process governed by internationally accepted standards, peer-reviewed methodologies, laboratory quality controls, and independent verification. One important point became especially clear. The DNA evidence presented during the trial was not the result of experimental technology. The genealogy represented an innovative investigative tool, but the direct DNA comparison between Randy Miller and the preserved biological evidence relied upon well-established forensic methods accepted throughout modern criminal justice systems. This distinction helps separate public fascination with genealogy from the scientific evidence ultimately considered by the jury. Detectives also testified about the years immediately preceding the arrest. Once genealogical research narrowed the list of potential suspects, investigators did not simply assume they had found the correct individual. Instead, they began another phase of traditional police work. Historical records were examined. Addresses were verified. Timelines were reconstructed. Background information was collected. Only after those steps did detectives obtain a lawfully recovered discarded DNA sample associated with Randy Miller. That comparison ultimately confirmed what genealogy had merely suggested. The prosecution emphasized patience. Nothing about the investigation had been rushed. After waiting more than 4 decades, investigators understood there was no justification for taking shortcuts during the final stages of the case. Every decision had to withstand legal scrutiny. Every laboratory procedure required documentation. Every investigative step had to remain transparent. The defense continued presenting its challenges through cross-examination. Attorneys questioned witnesses regarding investigative decisions made decades earlier. They explored possible alternative explanations for evidence. They examined procedural details surrounding forensic analysis. Such questioning reflected the ordinary operation of the adversarial legal system. Testing evidence is not an obstacle to justice. It is part of achieving justice. Reliable evidence should remain persuasive even after rigorous examination. The courtroom therefore became a place where scientific confidence and legal skepticism existed simultaneously. Outside the courthouse, public discussion expanded beyond the facts of Carla Walker's murder. The case had become one of the country's most recognizable examples of forensic genetic genealogy solving a historic cold case. Universities discussed the investigation in criminal justice courses. Law enforcement conferences reference the case when examining developments in forensic science. Media organizations produced detailed reports explaining how genealogical databases had transformed investigations once believed permanently unsolvable. Many viewers encountered an entirely new concept. The idea that distant relatives, people entirely unrelated to the crime, could help investigators identify unknown offenders through shared genetic ancestry seemed almost unbelievable. Experts repeatedly clarified the process. Investigators were not accusing relatives. They were following biological relationships documented through genealogy, then independently confirming identities using direct forensic comparisons. This careful distinction remained essential to understanding the investigation. Meanwhile, members of Carla Walker's family attended proceedings carrying emotions impossible to separate from the evidence presented before them. Nearly every witness revived another memory, another reminder, another chapter in a story they had never chosen to live. Families involved in long unsolved homicides often describe an unusual emotional experience during trial. The arrest brings relief. The courtroom reopens grief. Questions that remained silent for decades suddenly return every day through testimony, exhibits, and media attention. Justice requires revisiting the past. Healing rarely follows a predictable schedule. For Rodney McCoy, each appearance in court represented another return to the night that changed his life. His testimony remained consistent with the statements he had provided decades earlier. That consistency became significant. Although memories naturally evolve over time, the central events had never changed. An armed attacker approached. Violence erupted. Darla was abducted. She never returned. His account continued to align with the physical evidence preserved since the original investigation. As proceedings continued, prosecutors also addressed the remarkable preservation of investigative records. Jurors viewed original reports written by detectives who had long since retired or passed away. Those documents revealed extraordinary attention to detail and measurements, sketches, photographs, evidence logs, interview summaries. Every page reflected investigators working without the benefit of future technology, but with a clear understanding that every observation might someday matter. Their professionalism had outlived their careers, and some never witnessed the arrests their work ultimately made possible. The prosecution acknowledged those contributions indirectly through the evidence itself. Each preserved report represented another voice from 1974 speaking inside a modern courtroom. Cold case investigators across the country watched the proceedings carefully. The Walker case demonstrated that solving historic crimes requires more than technological innovation. It requires institutional commitment. Evidence must survive decades. Efforts must remain organized. Property rooms must maintain integrity. Success depends as much upon discipline in the past as innovation in the present. Without careful preservation, genealogy alone could not solve murders. Without modern science, preserved evidence might never reveal its secrets. The investigation succeeded because both generations fulfilled their responsibilities. At the first collected the evidence. The second unlocked its meaning. As testimony neared its conclusion, the jury had heard from investigators, forensic scientists, and expert witnesses. They had reviewed historical documentation created immediately after the crime. They had examined modern laboratory analyses. They had learned how traditional detective work and contemporary genetics converged after nearly half a century. The legal process now approached its final stage. In closing arguments. Unlike witness testimony, closing arguments allow attorneys to assemble individual pieces of evidence into one coherent narrative. Prosecutors prepared to explain why the scientific evidence, viewed together with the historical investigation, established Randy Miller's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense prepared to argue why the jury should examine every piece of evidence cautiously, particularly in a case separated from the crime itself by almost 50 years. For the jurors, the responsibility remained enormous. They were not historians. They were not scientists. They were not detectives. They were ordinary citizens asked to evaluate extraordinary evidence. Their decision would determine whether one of Texas's oldest cold cases concluded with legal accountability or remained forever suspended between scientific certainty and judicial proof. Beyond the courtroom walls, Fort Worth waited. The city had carried Carla Walker's memory for generations. Children who had not yet been born when she disappeared were now adults with families of their own. Many knew the story only through newspaper anniversaries and televised retrospectives. Others remembered the fear that settled over the community in December 1974. Everyone understood the significance of what was unfolding. This was no longer simply the story of an unsolved murder. It had become the story of whether justice could survive the passage of time itself. And as attorneys prepared their final presentations, one truth stood above every legal argument and every scientific explanation. The evidence collected nearly 50 years earlier had finally reached the moment for which it had silently waited since the winter morning investigators sealed it into evidence bags, believing that someday, somehow, someone would discover the name it had protected for generations. As the presentation of evidence came to an end, the courtroom grew noticeably quieter. The rapid pace of witness testimony gave way to a different atmosphere, one defined not by new revelations but by reflection. Jurors had spent days examining nearly 5 decades of investigative history. They had listened to detectives explain decisions made by officers who had long since retired. They had heard forensic scientists describe methods that did not exist when Carla Walker was murdered. They had followed the evolution of an investigation that refused to disappear despite the relentless passage of time. Now, every fact, every document, and every scientific conclusion rested before them. The prosecution began its closing argument by returning to the night of December 17, 1974. A 17-year-old girl attended a football game. She spent time with her boyfriend after the game. An armed stranger approached without warning. Violence erupted. Carla Walker was abducted. 2 days later, she was found dead. Those facts, prosecutors reminded the jury, had never been disputed. What had remained unknown for decades was the identity of the attacker. That mystery, they argued, had finally been answered by evidence preserved since the earliest hours of the investigation. The prosecution carefully reconstructed the investigative journey, not as a dramatic story, not as speculation, but as a sequence of documented events supported by records created across nearly 50 years. The original detectives collected biological evidence. Laboratories preserved it. Advances in DNA science produced a genetic profile. Forensic genetic genealogy generated an investigative lead. Detectives followed that led through conventional police work. A direct DNA comparison connected Randy Miller to the preserved evidence. Every stage depended upon the previous one. Remove any single step, prosecutors argued, and the investigation could not have reached its conclusion. The prosecution also addressed the extraordinary length of time between the crime and the arrest. Rather than viewing those decades as a weakness, they presented them as evidence of persistence. The passage of time had not manufactured new evidence. It had merely allowed science to interpret evidence that investigators had possessed all along. The DNA profile had waited. Technology eventually caught up. Justice followed. Prosecutors reminded jurors that no witness had appeared decades later claiming sudden recollection. No confession had unexpectedly surfaced. No anonymous letter had solved the case. Instead, the breakthrough came from physical evidence collected before DNA profiling even existed. That evidence, they argued, carried exceptional credibility precisely because it had remained unchanged through every generation of the investigation. The defense presented its own closing argument, emphasizing the jury's obligation to examine every piece of evidence carefully and to apply the standard of proof required in every criminal trial. Defense counsel reminded jurors that the burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. The defendant was not required to prove innocence. The prosecution alone bore responsibility for establishing guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This principle, fundamental to the justice system, remained unchanged regardless of the age of the case or the emotional impact of the crime. Attorneys encouraged jurors to consider the reliability of evidence collected decades earlier, the challenges presented by the passage of time, and the importance of carefully evaluating expert testimony. Such arguments reflected the ordinary process of criminal litigation. The adversarial system depends upon both sides presenting competing interpretations of the evidence. Jurors then retired to deliberate. For the Walker family, the waiting resumed. Although the circumstances differed dramatically from those of 1974, another period of uncertainty had begun. This time, however, the uncertainty centered not upon identifying the suspect, but upon determining whether the evidence presented would satisfy the legal standard required for conviction. Every criminal trial eventually reaches this point. Attorneys stop speaking. Witnesses stop testifying. The courtroom grows still. Responsibility shifts entirely to the jury. 12 citizens carry the weight of the evidence into a private deliberation room where no cameras record their discussions and no reporters observe their reasoning. Only the final verdict becomes public. While the jury deliberated, many people reflected upon the remarkable journey of the investigation itself. Nearly half a century separated the crime from the arrest. Generations of detectives had worked the case. Scientific disciplines had evolved beyond anything imaginable in 1974. The successful identification of a suspect through preserved biological evidence represented a milestone not only for Fort Worth, but also for cold case investigations nationwide. Law enforcement professionals recognized that the Walker investigation demonstrated several enduring principles. Never underestimate the future value of physical evidence. Never assume today's scientific limitations will remain permanent. Never regard an unsolved homicide as beyond hope simply because years have passed. Those lessons extended far beyond a single courtroom. Across the United States, evidence rooms contained biological samples collected decades earlier. Some belonged to cases already forgotten by the public. Others remained well known but apparently unsolvable. The Walker investigation encouraged agencies to review preserved evidence with fresh optimism. What had once seemed impossible increasingly appeared achievable. The jury eventually returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations stopped. Families sat quietly. Attorneys organized their notes. Reporters prepared to document history. The verdict represented the final stage of a legal process that had begun with a violent crime nearly 5 decades earlier. In August 2023, after considering the evidence presented during the trial, the jury found Randy Miller guilty of the murder of Carla Walker. The conviction marked the first time that a court had formally assigned criminal responsibility for the killing that had haunted Fort Worth since 1974. Following the guilty verdict, the jury assessed punishment. Randy Miller was sentenced to life imprisonment. For the Walker family, the verdict represented accountability after decades of uncertainty. It could not restore Carla's life. It could not erase the years spent waiting for answers. But it concluded the legal question that had remained unresolved for nearly half a century. The reaction inside the courtroom reflected the emotional complexity common to long-delayed justice. There was relief. There was sadness. There was gratitude toward investigators whose persistence never ended. There was recognition that many people who devoted years to solving the case were no longer alive to witness the conviction. Original detectives, laboratory personnel, members of the investigative team. Some had spent portions of their careers pursuing answers that ultimately arrived only after they were gone. Their work nevertheless remained visible throughout the trial. Every preserved report, every evidence log, every carefully labeled exhibit. Each represented another contribution to a case that refused to disappear. After the verdict, officials reflected publicly upon the extraordinary cooperation required to solve the investigation. The success belonged not to one detective or one laboratory, but 2 generations of professionals working across decades. The original investigators protected the evidence. Forensic scientists preserved its integrity. And genealogists applied innovative research methods. Modern detectives combined science with traditional investigative techniques. Prosecutors organized the evidence into a case capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. A stage depended upon every stage before it. The conviction also reinforced an increasingly important reality within criminal justice. Time does not necessarily weaken every homicide investigation. In some cases, time strengthens it. Scientific advances continue. Analytical methods improve. Databases expand. Historical records become increasingly accessible. Evidence that once appeared silent may eventually reveal answers unavailable to earlier generations. The Carla Walker case became one of the clearest examples of that transformation. For the community of Fort Worth, the verdict closed one of the city's longest-running criminal investigations. Yet closure itself remained a complicated word. A legal case can close. Grief rarely does. The Walker family had received justice through the courts. The absence left by Carla's murder remained permanent. That truth exists in every homicide case regardless of the verdict. The criminal justice system determines responsibility. It cannot return stolen years. As people left the courthouse following the conviction, many recognized they had witnessed more than the conclusion of a single murder trial. They had witnessed the convergence of history, science, perseverance, and law. A crime committed in 1974 had finally been answered in 2023, not because anyone stopped searching, but because generation after generation refused to allow the evidence to be forgotten. The case that once symbolized frustration had become a symbol of possibility. It proved that even after nearly 50 years, justice could still find its way through the silence. The conviction of Randy Miller did more than bring a decades-long murder investigation to a legal conclusion. It immediately became a landmark case studied by detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and criminal justice researchers across the United States. While Carla Walker's family finally received a measure of justice, professionals within the criminal justice system saw something equally significant. The investigation demonstrated that a homicide committed in an era without DNA technology could ultimately be solved through the careful preservation of evidence and the responsible application of modern science. It was not simply another successful prosecution. It was a blueprint for how future cold cases could be approached. Long before forensic genetic genealogy entered public awareness, cold case investigations followed a familiar pattern. Detectives reopened old files. Witnesses were interviewed again. Physical evidence was re-examined using whatever scientific tools were available. Occasionally, someone confessed. Sometimes a witness remembered a forgotten detail. More often, however, the investigation reached another dead end. Without new evidence, even the most experienced investigators could do little more than revisit the same unanswered questions. The Carla Walker investigation illustrated how dramatically that reality had changed. The evidence itself had not become stronger. Science had become more capable. This distinction is critical. Technology did not create new facts. It revealed facts that had always existed within the preserved biological evidence. The DNA profile recovered from the crime scene had remained unchanged since 1974. Investigators simply lacked the scientific tools necessary to interpret it during the original investigation. That lesson now influences homicide investigations throughout the world. Today, crime scene investigators routinely preserve biological evidence with extraordinary care, recognizing that future scientific developments may reveal information currently beyond forensic capabilities. Evidence that appears insignificant today may become decisive decades later. The Walker case reinforced this philosophy. Never assume the limits of current science are permanent. Throughout law enforcement agencies across the United States, cold case units increasingly began reviewing investigations from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Cases involving preserved biological evidence received renewed attention. Detectives asked a simple question: could forensic genetic genealogy succeed where previous investigative methods had failed? In many instances, the answer proved to be yes. Families who had spent decades believing justice would never arrive suddenly received unexpected telephone calls. Investigations reopened. Suspects were identified. Arrests followed. The success of these investigations reflected not only scientific innovation, but also institutional patience. Evidence preserved for generations finally fulfilled its purpose. The Carla Walker investigation became one of the examples frequently discussed in professional training programs, police academies, detective schools, forensic science conferences, university criminal justice courses. Each examined different aspects of the investigation. Some focused upon crime scene preservation. Others analyzed genealogical methodology. Prosecutors studied evidentiary strategy. Laboratory scientists evaluated forensic procedures. The case offered lessons extending far beyond one murder. Among the most important lessons involved documentation. Investigators in 1974 recorded evidence with remarkable precision, despite having no knowledge of future DNA analysis. Every photograph, every sketch, every evidence label, every laboratory submission. Those records became indispensable decades later. Without comprehensive documentation, modern investigators would have struggled to reconstruct historical decisions. Memory fades. Written records endure. That principle remains fundamental to every successful criminal investigation. The case also highlighted the importance of collaboration. No single individual solved Carla Walker's murder. The investigation succeeded because specialists from different disciplines contributed their expertise. Detectives gathered information. Crime scene personnel preserved evidence. Laboratory scientists analyzed DNA. Professional genealogists reconstructed family relationships. Prosecutors evaluated legal strategy. Each discipline depended upon the others. Modern cold case investigations increasingly follow this collaborative model. Complex crimes rarely yield to isolated efforts. They require coordinated expertise. Public interest in forensic genetic genealogy also expanded following the Walker conviction. Many people first learned that genealogy websites could indirectly assist criminal investigations. This generated widespread discussion regarding both investigative effectiveness and personal privacy. Supporters emphasized the extraordinary humanitarian value of solving murders that had devastated families for decades. They argued that identifying violent offenders served both justice and public safety. Others raised questions concerning privacy, informed consent, and the evolving relationship between personal genetic information and law enforcement investigations. These discussions extended far beyond the Walker case. Cortez. Legislatures, academic researchers, privacy advocates, law enforcement organizations. Each contributed perspectives regarding the responsible use of emerging forensic technologies. The Carla Walker investigation, therefore, became part of a broader societal conversation about balancing investigative capability with ethical safeguards. Forensic genetic genealogy itself continued evolving. Professional organizations developed best practice guidelines. Laboratories refined analytical methods. Investigators established standardized procedures governing when genealogy should be used and how leads should be documented. The objective remained clear. Scientific innovation must operate within established legal and ethical frameworks. Successful investigations depend not only upon technological capability, but also upon public confidence. The Walker investigation demonstrated both the promise and the responsibility accompanying these powerful investigative tools. For Carla Walker's family, however, these broader debates remained secondary. Their experience reflected something deeply personal rather than theoretical. Nearly 50 years separated Carla's murder from the conviction. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Entire chapters of family history unfolded while the investigation remained unresolved. Justice eventually arrived. Time did not return. That reality serves as a powerful reminder that every cold case involves real people whose lives continue long after headlines disappear. Families do not experience homicide investigations as historical events. They experience them as ongoing absences. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering, the missing person remains present through absence. The Walker family carried that absence across generations. The conviction could never erase it. It could only establish legal accountability. Investigators who reflected publicly after the trial often emphasized persistence. Cold case work rarely produces immediate results. Years may pass without meaningful progress. Budget limitations, personnel changes, technological barriers, competing investigations, all present significant challenges. Yet successful cold case detectives share one defining characteristic. They refuse to assume that unsolved means unsolvable. The Carla Walker investigation embodied that philosophy. For decades, detectives continued preserving evidence, reviewing files, and monitoring scientific developments, even when no immediate breakthrough appeared likely. Their patience ultimately proved justified. Another lesson involved institutional memory. Large investigations often outlast individual careers. The detective assigned to a case today may retire long before it reaches resolution. Proper record keeping, therefore, becomes essential. Future investigators must understand not only what earlier detectives discovered, but also why certain decisions were made. The Walker case demonstrated exceptional continuity despite spanning multiple generations of investigators. Each team inherited the work of those who came before. Each preserved the investigation for those who would follow. That continuity became one of the case's greatest strengths. Outside professional circles, the public largely remembered the case through its extraordinary timeline. A teenager murdered in 1974, an arrest in 2020, a conviction in 2023. Those dates alone captured international attention. Yet behind those milestones lay thousands of hours of investigative work rarely visible in news headlines. Countless evidence reviews, repeated laboratory analyses, historical research, genealogical reconstruction, illegal preparation, scientific validation. The eventual breakthrough represented not one dramatic discovery, but the accumulation of decades of disciplined effort. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the Carla Walker investigation. Justice sometimes advances quietly, not through spectacular revelations, not through dramatic confessions, but through patient professionals who preserve evidence, follow established procedures, embrace responsible scientific innovation, and refuse to abandon victims simply because years continue passing. As law enforcement agencies around the world continue reopening historic investigations, the Walker case remains an enduring reminder that evidence can outlive assumptions. The people who committed crimes decades ago often believed time would protect them. The investigation into Carla Walker's murder demonstrated that time may instead become an ally of justice. Science continues advancing. Technology continues improving. Evidence continues waiting. And somewhere inside countless evidence rooms across the world, preserved biological samples collected years ago may already contain the answers to crimes that families are still waiting to hear. The Carla Walker investigation did not simply conclude with a conviction. It permanently altered the way many investigators viewed the relationship between time and justice. For generations, detectives had often spoken of unsolved murders as battles against the clock. Every day without an arrest increased the likelihood that witnesses would disappear, memories would fade, and physical evidence would deteriorate. While those challenges remain real, the Walker case demonstrated another possibility. In some investigations, time is no longer only an enemy. When evidence has been carefully preserved and science continues advancing, time can also become an unexpected ally. This realization has reshaped the philosophy of cold case investigations across the United States. For many years, limited resources forced police departments to prioritize recent violent crimes. Detectives understandably focused on investigations where witnesses remained available and fresh evidence could still be collected. Cold cases often waited in storage, revisited only occasionally when a new lead emerged or when investigative workloads allowed. The success of cases like Carla Walker's encouraged many agencies to reconsider that approach. Rather than viewing old files as historical records, departments increasingly began treating them as active investigations waiting for new scientific opportunities. Evidence rooms became more than storage facilities. They became archives of potential future prosecutions. Across Texas and throughout the country, detectives began reviewing homicide files with renewed determination. The first question often became remarkably simple. Does preserved biological evidence still exist? If the answer was yes, investigators examined whether modern forensic methods could provide information unavailable when the crime originally occurred. Some cases had already benefited from conventional DNA profiling. Others required more advanced laboratory analysis. Still others became candidates for forensic genetic genealogy. Every investigation demanded individual evaluation. No two cold cases are identical. The Walker investigation illustrated another essential truth. Technology alone cannot solve crimes. Scientific advances are powerful only when supported by careful police work. Forensic genetic genealogy did not eliminate the need for detectives. It expanded their investigative capabilities. Once genealogy identified Randy Miller as a possible suspect, investigators still needed to confirm historical facts. They verified addresses. They reconstructed timelines. They obtained a lawful DNA sample. They followed traditional investigative procedures before making an arrest. This combination of science and detective work became one of the defining characteristics of successful modern cold case investigations. One cannot replace the other. Science provides direction. Investigators provide context. The courtroom determines whether the evidence satisfies the legal standard required for conviction. Another lesson emerged from the extraordinary preservation of evidence. Crime scene investigators often work under difficult conditions. Violent crime scenes can be emotionally overwhelming. Environmental factors may threaten physical evidence. Investigators frequently operate under intense public pressure to produce immediate answers. Yet the Walker case demonstrated why methodical evidence collection remains essential regardless of immediate investigative prospects. The officers who processed the crime scene in December 1974 had no way of knowing that DNA technology would someday identify the offender. Nevertheless, they preserved biological evidence according to the best professional standards available at the time. Their diligence became one of the most important factors contributing to the eventual resolution of the case. Professional training programs now frequently emphasize this point. Every crime scene deserves meticulous attention. No investigator can predict which item of evidence may become decisive decades later. The smallest biological sample, a carefully labeled envelope, an accurately documented photograph. Each may one day answer questions that seem impossible today. The Walker investigation reinforced that philosophy with remarkable clarity. It also demonstrated the value of continuity within law enforcement organizations. Cold cases often survive multiple generations of investigators. Detectives retire. Supervisors change. Laboratory personnel move into new positions. Without comprehensive documentation, institutional knowledge can disappear. The Walker case avoided that problem because investigators consistently maintained detailed records. Successive detectives inherited organized files rather than fragmented recollections. Historical decisions remained understandable because they had been documented at the time they were made. Institutional memory became almost as valuable as forensic evidence itself. The case also attracted considerable attention from academic researchers studying criminal investigations. Universities analyzed the interaction between forensic science, investigative strategy, and legal procedure. Students examined how technological innovation affected traditional investigative methods. Researchers explored the practical implications of genealogical analysis within established criminal justice frameworks. The Walker investigation became an educational case study extending beyond policing into forensic science, law, ethics, and public policy. Another important discussion concerned public trust. Scientific breakthroughs generate excitement. They also require transparency. Investigators involved in the Walker case consistently emphasized that forensic genetic genealogy generated an investigative lead rather than direct proof of guilt. The decisive evidence came from the subsequent direct DNA comparison and the totality of the investigation. This distinction protects both scientific integrity and public confidence. Accurate communication prevents misunderstanding. It ensures that extraordinary technology is understood within its proper legal context. Cold case investigators frequently remind the public that no single technique solves every investigation. Some crimes leave no recoverable biological evidence. Some evidence deteriorates beyond scientific usefulness. Some investigations depend upon entirely different forms of proof. Forensic genetic genealogy represents one powerful investigative tool among many. Its effectiveness depends upon the circumstances of each individual case. The Walker investigation happened to possess several critical elements. Carefully preserved biological evidence. A usable DNA profile. Genealogical connections capable of directing investigators toward a suspect. Not every cold case contains those same advantages. Nevertheless, the investigation expanded possibilities that had once appeared unreachable. For Carla Walker's family, the broader professional recognition surrounding the case remained secondary to the simple reality that accountability had finally been established. The conviction did not erase nearly 5 decades of grief. It did not restore birthdays missed, holidays changed forever, or family milestones experienced without Carla. Justice cannot reverse history. It can only acknowledge responsibility. That distinction remained evident in statements made after the trial. Family members expressed appreciation for the persistence of investigators while recognizing that loss itself never disappears. Many homicide survivors describe justice as necessary but incomplete. Legal accountability matters profoundly. Emotional healing follows its own path. The Walker investigation also honored another group whose contributions often remain invisible: the forensic scientists. Laboratory analysts rarely appear in newspaper headlines. Their work unfolds quietly inside secure facilities far from television cameras. Yet their precision determines whether biological evidence becomes reliable courtroom testimony. In this case, laboratory professionals separated by decades contributed to the final outcome. Scientists working with limited technology in earlier years preserved possibilities for future colleagues equipped with far more sophisticated methods. Each generation built upon the work of the previous.